For 30 years, I believed that every sacrifice and every hour of overtime was to secure the future of my own flesh and blood. But this morning, as my wife's casket was slowly lowered into the cold ground of the cemetery here in Greenwich, Connecticut, I noticed something that chilled me more than death itself. My 3 children weren't looking at the grave with tears in their eyes, they were looking at their Rolexes and subtly calculating the resale value of our family estate. What they didn't know was that last night, while they slept in the guest rooms I paid for, I had turned the key to the old oak chest that had always been off limits. Inside, I didn't find memories of a happy life. I found devastating, scientific proof that not one of them carries my DNA. I gave them 30 years of unconditional love and a life of luxury. Now, I will give them exactly 24 hours. 24 hours to vacate my property and get out of my life forever. The midday sun beat down on the cemetery, a dry, suffocating East Coast heat that made everyone's forehead glisten. But I felt an absolute cold deep in my bones. It was a frozen, surgical sensation that started in my gut and spread to my fingertips. In front of me, the polished mahogany casket descended into the dark earth. Inside was the woman I had shared a bed, a table, and 30 years of mortgage payments with. I felt a single, heavy, genuine tear roll down my cheek. Despite what I had discovered the night before, the pain of loss was real. I had lost my wife, but I had also lost the lie that sustained my reality. Around me, the silence should have been sacred. However, my ears, trained by years of high-stakes corporate negotiations, caught the static noise of indifference. To my right stood Mark, the oldest. He wore a black Italian-cut suit that I had paid for when he graduated with his MBA from Wharton. He wasn't looking at the grave. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, but his head was tilted down toward his palm. I noticed the blue glow of his phone screen reflecting subtly in his lenses. He wasn't reading prayers. His thumb moved in quick, rhythmic swipes. He was checking the stock market or perhaps answering emails for his own startup, the one he founded with my seed capital. To him, burying his mother was unproductive downtime, an annoying pause in his busy executive schedule. To my left was Emily. She was crying, or at least making the right sounds at the right times. She dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, careful not to ruin the professional makeup Shed had applied that morning. But between sobs, I heard her whisper to her husband. She was complaining that the tent we hired didn't provide enough shade and that the humidity was going to ruin her blowout before the reception at the country club. Her grief was performative, an act designed for the audience of aunts and golf club associates watching us. Emily was always like that, more concerned with the aesthetics of tragedy than the tragedy itself. She glanced at me, not to see how I was doing, but to make sure I noticed how much she was suffering. And behind me, like a restless shadow, was David, the youngest. He was always the impulsive one, the one who never finished his degree at NYU, the one who always had $1 million idea that required an urgent investment. He stepped up and put a hand on my shoulder. For a brief, naive second, I thought I was receiving comfort, but his low, raspy voice brought me back to reality. He asked if we had decided what to do with the art collection in the house yet, because he knew a buyer in NYC who paid in cash. I felt nauseous. It wasn't the heat, it was physical revulsion at the greed of my own children. Their mother's body hadn't even touched the bottom of the grave, and they were already taking inventory of the assets. The ceremony continued with the slowness of a nightmare. The priest spoke of eternal love, sacrifice, and family. Words that bounced around my mind with cruel irony. I looked at my so-called children lined up like flawless, empty magazine models. I mentally calculated how much money I had invested in them. Private schools, tennis lessons, new cars every year, extravagant weddings when they turned 25, silent financial bailouts, millions of dollars drained from my accounts to ensure their well-being. For years, I told myself it was worth it, that it was my duty as a father. Now, with the secret burning in my inner coat pocket, that investment looked like the biggest fraud in my financial history. They weren't my heirs, they were parasites who had consumed the resources of the wrong host. People began to pass by to offer their condolences. A parade of damp hands and limp hugs, friends from the club, partners from the law firm, curious neighbors. Everyone repeated the same script. "I'm so sorry. She was a great woman. We're here for whatever you need." I nodded mechanically, shook hands, and gave thanks with a steady voice. I kept my posture upright, shoulders back. Stoicism was my armor. No one was to notice that inside I was falling apart and rebuilding myself at the same time. No one was to suspect that while they saw a grieving widower, I was a judge passing sentence in silence. I watched as Mark loosened his tie and checked his watch with blatant impatience. He gestured to his siblings. They huddled together away from the others, forming a closed circle. I sharpened my gaze. They weren't hugging, they were arguing. I saw Emily point toward the parking lot where my SUV was parked and then point toward the house. David pulled out a vape pen and released a discreet cloud of vapor while nodding. They were planning the logistics of the afternoon, not the logistics of morning, but of the distribution. They were anxious to get to the house, open the bottles of Napa wine in my cellar, and above all, get their hands on that oak chest. That damn chest my wife had forbidden them from touching their entire lives, fueling the fantasy that it contained bearer bonds or family diamonds. The irony was perfect. They wanted to open that chest to enrich themselves, not knowing I had already opened it to destroy them. The last handful of dirt hit the wood with a dull, final thud. The ritual was over. The priest closed his book. People began to disperse toward their air-conditioned cars, relieved to escape the sun and the presence of death. Mark approached me, already wearing his sunglasses, car keys in hand. His tone was one of fake concern, that condescending voice people use with the elderly or children. He told me it would be better to leave, as there was a lot of paperwork to review at the house and he didn't want me to get exhausted. I looked him straight in the eye, searching for any trace of myself in him. There was nothing, not in the shape of his gaze nor in his character. "You're right," I replied with a calm that disconcerted him a bit. "There are very important papers we must read today." I walked to my car alone, rejecting his offer for a ride. I needed those minutes of solitude behind the wheel. I needed to breathe deeply before the real storm began. The funeral had been the stage for the illusion. The house would be the stage for the truth. The drive from the cemetery to the house was an exercise in absolute restraint. I drove my own car, a gray German sedan I bought 4 years ago, following the caravan of luxury vehicles my supposed children had bought with my money. As I pulled into the cobblestone driveway, I noticed the lawn was impeccable. The landscaper had come on Tuesday as always. I paid $250 a month for that service just so my wife could see her roses from her bedroom window. Now those roses looked like spots of clotted blood against the white wall. I parked and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was the only thing that offered me a second of peace. Entering the house, the air still smelled like a sickening mix of medication, funeral flowers, and industrial disinfectant. There were half-finished plastic cups on the mahogany entry table, crumpled napkins on the floor, and plates with dried hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen. The house was a mess, the kind of logistical chaos death leaves behind. I waited with a naivety that almost made me laugh for one of them to take off their coat and pick something up. Perhaps Emily would wash a plate. Perhaps David would take out the overflowing trash bag. But no. They stepped over the mess as if they were guests in a 5-star hotel where the cleaning service is invisible and automatic. They walked straight to the living room. Mark loosened his tie and dropped into my favorite leather armchair, the one my wife gave me when I turned 50. Emily kicked off her heels, leaving them in the middle of the Persian rug, and went straight to the bar to pour herself a glass of my best Cabernet without even asking. David, always restless, began pacing the room, touching objects, evaluating them like an appraiser at a liquidation auction. I stood by the doorframe, watching them. I felt like I was watching a documentary about hyenas devouring the remains of a kill, only the kill was my life and I was still breathing. Mark took a long sip of his drink, sighed theatrically, and broke the silence. "Dad, sit down, please. We need to talk about practical things," he said in that executive voice practiced in front of a mirror. "We know it's a difficult day, but life goes on, and there are decisions that can't wait." I sat in a stiff wooden chair across from them. I crossed my legs and interlaced my fingers over my knee, keeping my face expressionless. "I'm listening," I said. 2 words. Not one more. "The 3 of us have been talking," Mark continued, gesturing to his siblings with his glass. "And we think this house is just too big for you alone. It's over 6,000 square feet, Dad. The maintenance, the property taxes, the yard. It's absurd for a man your age to deal with all this. Besides, it brings back sad memories. Mom is in every corner. It's not healthy." Emily nodded fervently, her lips stained with wine. "Exactly, Daddy. It's for your own good. Mark has a contact at a luxury real estate firm who could put it on the market next week. Prices in this part of Connecticut are at a historic peak. You could make a fortune, buy a nice modern condo near the club, and the rest. Well, the rest can be invested or distributed to help us consolidate our projects. Mom would have wanted you to help us." There it was. The dead mother card. They played it in less than 10 minutes. I felt a sting of anger in my chest, but I kept my heart rate under control. It was fascinating to see how they disguised their greed as filial concern. They didn't want me to be comfortable, they wanted immediate liquidity. "And is that all?" I asked neutrally. "Selling my home is your only concern today?" David stopped in front of the fireplace and turned. His eyes glittered with childish greed. "No, that's not all. There's the chest. Mom's oak chest." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The mention of the chest tightened everyone's muscles. That old rustic piece of furniture with its rusted iron hardware had always sat at the foot of the master bed, closed with a heavy padlock. My wife had told them since they were children that she kept her most precious treasure in there. Their imaginations, fueled by a lack of work ethic, had turned that treasure into gold bars, antique jewelry, or Swiss bank account documents. "We need to open it today," Emily said, leaning forward. "It's part of the estate. We have a right to know what's inside. Mom promised me her jewelry would be mine, and I'm sure it's in there. We didn't see it on her vanity. And if there are financial documents, bearer bonds, or cash, we need to secure them before." "Well, before they get lost or something happens," Mark added, looking at me with suspicion, as if I were capable of stealing what they believed was theirs. What they didn't know was that the padlock had already been breached. They didn't know the treasure had no monetary value, but a destructive value beyond calculation. I imagined their faces if I told them right then that the chest only contained evidence that their mother had been sleeping with her tennis pro and the local pediatrician. I imagined telling them the only gold they'd find was the color of aged paper from obscene letters. But no. This wasn't the moment. Punishment must be proportional and executed with precision. Ruining the surprise now would be a tactical waste. "The chest is in my room," I said calmly. "And today is the day of your mother's funeral. We are not opening anything now. I don't have the energy to hunt for the key or deal with your pirate fantasies of finding a treasure map." "But Dad," David protested, stepping toward me. I raised a hand. It was a slight gesture, but loaded with an authority they hadn't seen in years. They shut up. I said, "Not now. Tomorrow. Tomorrow at noon, everyone comes here. We'll eat. We'll talk about the house, the inheritance, and we'll open the chest. Bring your spouses. I want the whole family present for what we are going to discover." Mark exchanged a look with Emily. I saw the calculation in his eyes. One more day of waiting in exchange for the promise of access to everything. They accepted the deal. "All right," Mark said, standing up and smoothing his suit. "Tomorrow at noon." "Dad, seriously, think about the house. I already told people I'd call them Monday. Don't make us look bad." "Don't worry," I replied, standing up to signal the visit was over. "No one is going to look bad. Everyone will get exactly what they deserve." That same evening, I headed to downtown Greenwich to see Guzman. In Connecticut legal circles, he was known as the Bulldog. Guzman, a clean-shaven man who had seen the worst of human nature in his 40 years of family law practice, immediately noticed the coldness in my eyes. "Close the door, Robert," he said, taking off his glasses to wipe them with a silk handkerchief. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I didn't see a ghost, Guzman. I saw reality." I placed 3 yellow envelopes from a genetic testing lab onto his massive mahogany desk. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was dry and short, like a suppressed gunshot. Guzman opened the first envelope. His eyes scanned the numbers, percentages, and conclusions. He frowned. He opened the second, then the third. When he looked up, he was no longer looking at me as an old golfing buddy, but as a client with the most explosive case of his career. "Paternity fraud," he murmured, weighing the words. "Willful concealment. Robert, do you realize what this means from a legal standpoint?" "I know what it means morally," I replied, sitting in the armchair. "It means Eve spent 30 years supporting 3 strangers. I'm here for you to explain the letter of the law. I want to destroy them, Guzman. Not physically. Financially. I want them to walk out of my life as naked as they entered it." Guzman nodded and pulled out a legal pad. "First, filiation. Although you are legally recognized as the father on their birth certificates, the DNA tests prove there is no biological link. Since there was a concealment of truth by the mother, we are dealing with a vitiated consent. You accepted paternity under a delusion caused by intentional deception." I liked the sound of that. Delusion caused by deception. Those words lifted the guilt from my shoulders and placed it exactly where it belonged. "Second," Guzman continued, "your current will is revoked de facto. Well, draft a new one right now. Well, include a disinheritance for unworthiness clause. But that's for the future. You're interested in the now, aren't you?" "Exactly. I want them out of my house today." Guzman gave a thin smile, the smile of a predator that had caught the scent of blood. "That's the easy part. The house is private property, titled solely in your name. They are adults. There is no lease agreement. Legally, their status is occupants at sufferance, tenants without right of possession. You can revoke their permission to stay at any moment. Well, prepare a notice to quit. Well, give them 24 hours out of a sense of humanity, though by law, I could have the sheriff put them out immediately." "And the money?" I asked. "The cars, the credit cards, the trust funds. Are the cars registered to your company?" "Yes." "Then tomorrow morning, we file for repossession. The credit cards are authorized users on your accounts. Block them via the mobile app right now. As for their businesses that you're funding, we're simply going to cut off the oxygen." I walked out of his office with a folder of documents that weighed no more than a pound but possessed the power of an atomic bomb. The next morning, at exactly noon, they were there. Mark, Emily, and David were sitting in the living room with their spouses. The atmosphere was festive, almost like Christmas, if you ignored the fact that they had just buried their mother. They had already opened a bottle of Veuve Clicquot from my cellar. I walked into the room with that same oak chest. I set it on the coffee table. The thud of the chest hitting the table silenced them. "Dad, finally!" David exclaimed, rubbing his hands together. We've been waiting. So, where are the keys? I didn't sit down. I remained standing, looming over them. Before we open the chest, I want you to sign some papers. It's a formality for the real estate transfer you've been asking for. I handed out copies of the eviction notices and the DNA results, face down. Sign the first page, I commanded. They signed, almost without looking, blinded by greed. Mark even smirked. See, Dad, we just want to help you lighten the load. Now, I said, turn over the second sheet. The silence that fell over the room was so deep I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I watched the color drain from their faces. Mark reread the report 3 times. Emily dropped her glass, an expensive champagne soaked into the rug she had wanted to sell yesterday. What kind of joke is this? Mark rasped. Dad, this isn't funny. It's not a joke, Mark. It's science. And that is your eviction notice. On the first page you just signed, there is a date and time. You have 24 hours to pack your things. Tomorrow at noon, the gate codes will be changed. The locks will be replaced. Your cars, the ones registered to my firm, will be remotely disabled via GPS tracking at 6 p.m. today. You can't do this. Emily shrieked. We're your children. You raised us. No, Emily. I raised a lie. I paid for the stage props for your mother's performance. The play is over. The curtain has fallen. I walked over to the chest and broke the lock, which had already been sawed through. I opened the lid. There was no gold inside. There were neat bundles of letters, Polaroid photos, and Claudia's old diary. Here is your inheritance, I threw a stack of photos onto the table. Take a look at your real father's. Mark, it seems yours is that tennis pro from the Riverside Club who gave your mother free lessons on Saturdays. Emily, David. The diary has all the names and dates. You can build your family tree in your spare time. David tried to lung at me, but I only looked at him coldly. Leave, David. Before I call the police. You are officially trespassers on my private property. They left. It wasn't like a movie scene with screaming and sobbing. It was like rats fleeing a sinking ship. They grabbed bags, keys, and a few small valuables while I stood there, watching the clock. 24 hours later, the house grew silent. For the first time in 30 years, I felt that the house truly belonged to me. Thank you for listening to my story all the way through. If it resonated with you, give it a like, comment on what touched you the most, and be sure to mention where you're from. Subscribe to the channel, there are plenty more stories to come.